Good evening and welcome to SFU. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Squamish, Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, Katzie, and Coquitlam peoples on whose traditional territories our three campuses stand. We recognize that their traditional lands were taken and their languages and cultures displaced by colonial powers. We recognize, too, the ongoing need to support dialogue in the interest of building a relationship of trust and of mutual respect. My name is Paul Crow. I'm chair of the Department of Humanities, which is also home to the J.S. Wordsworth Chair, held by Dr. Eleanor Stebner, and the Institute for the Humanities, which is directed by Professor Samir Gandesha. For decades, both have vigorously engaged the university community and forged strong ties to the wider communities beyond SFU through continual and robust public programming. The Department of Humanities brings together scholars of diverse disciplinary training under one roof to provide students with an opportunity to address fundamental human questions and problems from a wide variety of cultural perspectives. As it stands, our students will have to cope with a pronounced move toward narrower nationalist and populist agendas in many regions of the world, often rooted in complex relationships to past decades of accelerating globalization of the so-called free market. And with economic disparities as capital continues to concentrate in the hands of fewer people, giving rise to widespread dissatisfaction and the threat of social instability. Immigration, too, has become a focus of popular discontent amid this network of tensions at a time when conflict and economic hardship have stimulated mass dislocation and movements of populations across borders around the world. All of this is taking place within the wider horizon, of course, of a global ecology that is threatened now with destabilization, resulting from generations of misguided human activity. The humanities is a key way that I think we can create and sustain a narrative of openness and of global cooperation through deeper cross-cultural, transnational mutual understanding as a way to address these formidable challenges together in a much more coordinated way. We face challenges that are not limited to our individual states and that cannot be addressed purely through localized responses. We need to reach out beyond Canada to forge friendships that will build capacity among academics, students, and also the wider citizenry. For critical reflection, to strengthen civil society for the purposes of supporting social and economic justice, and also a more mindful management of economies in ways that will foster true human well-being and a more sustainable future for every one of us, no matter where we live on this planet. With that in mind, I'd like to now invite FAST Dean Jane Polkingham to come and say a few words to us about FAST and its vision. Jane, welcome.
Thank you, Paul. I'm looking forward to tonight's talk by Dr. Valerian Rodrigues. The Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences is committed to intellectual diversity and exploring challenging new thoughts and ideas. And I'm grateful to Hari and Madhu Varshni for their Visiting Scholars program in Indian Studies. Visiting scholars bring fresh ideas to our metaphorical shores and allow us to re-examine our preconceptions in light of new knowledge. Visiting scholars are also important ambassadors for our faculty. Dr. Rodrigues' talk tonight will be particularly timely as he explores forging democratic futures. We live in challenging times for democracy, and Dr. Rodrigues' talk can offer us new ways to consider how we can give voice to marginalized populations. As Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, I'm regularly asked about the role of humanities in the university. And one of my answers to this question is to point to events like tonight's event. Tonight's talk is the kind that brings us together to think about democracy today and the possibilities of creating a world which is more just. This is a key role of the humanities, to educate, to share ideas, and to open up avenues for people to explore how to create a better world. And with that, I'd like to hand the floor to Andrew Petter, President of SFU.
Well, thank you, Jane. And I, too, want to say what a pleasure it is to be here this evening and to see this turnout for tonight's lecture. I want to welcome you all to the Seagull Graduate School, which is very much a vibrant part of our very vibrant downtown Vancouver campus, which now boasts 9 different facilities. We are by far the largest post-secondary presence in Vancouver, and that is very much a reflection of our commitment to be Canada's most community-engaged research university. This campus, in fact, is about to celebrate its 30th anniversary just next month, so if you notice the banners on the street, that's what they're all about. The mission to be Canada's most community-engaged research university also has a dimension that's international. And in particular, we have made it our commitment to promote intercultural engagement, international collaboration, and global understanding. And in fact, if you look at our university tagline, it is by no accident engaging the world. And indeed, it's due to our intercultural, international commitments that we're privileged to have Dr. Rodrigues here this evening. Dr. Rodrigues is the second person to come to SFU as the Hari and Madhu Varshney Visiting Scholar in Indian Studies. The Visiting Scholars Program is named for Hari and Madhu in recognition of the generous support they've provided to make this program possible. And I'm pleased to say that both Hari and Madhu are with us this evening, and I think we should show our appreciation to them. The programs also received generous support from others in the Indo-Canadian community, including Sarup and Indy Man, Barj and Rita Dahan, Surinder and Surjit Sandhu. And it's a first in Western Canada, a program that's intended to encourage and strengthen cultural relations between BC and India by hosting world-class Indian scholars from a wide range of disciplines. It is one, in fact, of a multitude of engagements that we at SFU are participating in building stronger connections with the South Asian community here in British Columbia and with India. And those efforts have been very much aided by a SFU India Advisory Council that was formed a number of years ago and which helps guide us in developing those relationships both at home and abroad. I'd like to thank them, and I'd also like, of course, to thank the Department of Humanities, which has organized this evening's event and has hosted Dr. Rodrigues during his time at SFU. And with that, now let me tell you a little bit about our guest lecturer this evening, Professor Valerian Rodrigues. Dr. Rodrigues has taught at Mangalore University in Karnataka, India, at JNU in New Delhi. Most recently, he was the Ambedkar Chair at Ambedkar University in Delhi. He also was the National Fellow of the Indian Council for Social Science Research. He's been an Indian scholar at a number of universities in Germany. He's well known for his work on politician and social reformer B.R. Ambedkar, and he's also made substantial contributions to scholarship on the Indian Parliament, Indian and South Asian political thought, constitutionalism in India, and political concepts of modernity, secularism, and nationalism. So he's someone who is, has wide knowledge that I know will be reflected in the lecture that he's going to give us this evening. He has, during his time at SFU, taught a humanities seminar on Ambedkar. He's also contributed to a seminar on Buddhist ethics in contemporary society, spoken about Indigenous peoples and the Indian state, given lectures at both our Harbor Center and our SFU Surrey campuses, and engaged with the local South Asian community organizations. So Hari and Madhu, we have certainly got our money's worth from Dr. Rodrigues, and it is just with great delight that I am pleased to welcome him to come to the stage and to speak to us about forging democratic futures and Ambedkar on complex marginalities and inclusion. Please join me in giving a very warm SFU welcome to Professor Valerian Rodrigues.
No, you didn't. President Petter, Dean of Arts and Social Sciences, Mrs. Madhu and Mr. Hari Vasne, Dr. Paul Crow, ladies and gentlemen. Before I begin, let me thank SFU for inviting me for a semester to be here to teach a course as well as to interact with scholars, students here. And I had a wonderful time in the last 3.5 months. I've spoken in several audiences, small and large, and I would carry these very pleasant memories back home. The Department of Humanities has been a home to me, a home away from home, particularly Professor Paul Crow and the excellent staff that is there in the department. Thank you very much, and it's my delight to speak this evening, and thank you for coming. While India's national movement against colonial rule traced a trajectory of its own, B.R. Ambedkar, that is Bhimrao Ramji Ambedkar, strove to give a distinct turn to it by avowing egalitarianism, constitutionalism, and moral grounding to the emerging nation-state. This turn grappled with the marginality of the socially excluded, untouchable communities that he hailed from, and the deep diversity constitutive of India. This evening, I wish to engage with and celebrate the thought and action of an iconic figure of 20th century on the day following his 128th birth anniversary. In this lecture, I think I need some help. Yeah. In this lecture, I wish to highlight 3 issues. 1, Ambedkar's critique of the Indian national movement, particularly its inability to reach out to deep marginalities. His considerations on the promise of democracy and its pragmatics, and the bearing that Ambedkar's frame of thought has on modes of oppression and social exclusion of our times. Interestingly, Ambedkar represented in his own person all these 3 dimensions. He hailed from one of the lowest of the low castes in India and spoke for them throughout his life. He reflected on the promise of democracy by engaging with deeply unequal and culturally diverse post-colonial society through his own voluminous writings spanning across 40 years and distinct set of political initiatives, including chairing the drafting committee of the Constitution of India and piloting the same through the acrimonious debate in the Constituent Assembly. While his learning and exposure to institutions of higher learning made him truly cosmopolitan, he was deeply wary of the promises of liberal democracy, Marxism, and nationalism that enchanted his generation, and was much more sensitive to the underside of cosmopolitanism, slaves, Jews, religious sensibilities, minorities, etc. Before I proceed, it might be, I hope I am able to work this out. Yeah, this is Ambedkar, one of the memorable photographs that we have of him. Before I proceed, it might be necessary that I clarify two concepts that I employ in this talk. That is complex marginality and democracy. By marginality, I mean the same as what Iris Marion Young, and some of you might be able to recall, this lady who died a couple of years ago, quite young. By marginality, I mean the same as what Iris Marion Young meant in her book, Justice and the Politics of Difference. That it is one of the faces of oppression that we confront today, alongside exploitation, powerlessness, cultural imperialism, and violence, that a large number of people are subjected worldwide. Marginality denies its victims useful participation in social life and equal access to its resources. It has a vicious hold over the life prospects of people subject to it and includes the elderly, the Aboriginals, young blacks and Latinos in the US, the refugees, the mentally and physically disabled, large sections of Dalits in India, etc. While human rights, particularly positivized in the constitutions and legal regimes of political communities, and cultural sensibilities have reached out to some forms of these marginalities, affecting at least certain strata, some of these marginalities, particularly grounded in religious, racial, and cultural ascriptions, and historical and political imaginaries, intersect and even compound. Such marginality is ascribed to individuals primarily as members of social groups and communities, as Professor Young was able to demonstrate continuously in her writings. This inheritance of stigma makes the members of these groups, marginals among marginals, relatively immune to the reach of rights and the promises of law. I term this marginality as complex marginality, and Ambedkar thought that he spoke for it. Democracy, of course, is a word that has been often used. Therefore, let me clarify the term the way I employ the term. Some of you might be sympathetic to the definition that I employ. By democracy, I mean a political community of free and equal members who wish to define their collective life in the indefinite future, irrespective of and taking along the differences among them. Such an understanding of democracy may take numerous forms, although across these forms, the attributes of liberty, equality, and community continue to be foundational. Ambedkar subscribed to such a notion of democracy and was its foremost thinker in India. Needless to say that such an understanding of democracy was deeply shaped through the readings of Rousseau, John Dewey, and the contestations on the future of India in the Indian national movement. What is the kind of relationship that Ambedkar sets up between nationalism and democracy? Indian democracy is closely bound with Indian national movement, but these distinctions that I make might be worth following. While the constitutional shape it assumed is deeply indebted to the British legacy in India, the nationalist leadership was actively involved in shaping the constitutional developments in India. The Indian Constitution itself is a breathtaking vision and regulative frame of a political community with few parallels elsewhere. Three unique features characterize the Indian national movement. It was a mass movement involving large sections of the working classes and the peasantry. It was a movement that wore non-violence as its emblem, and it was a movement that self-consciously brought cultural memories of the past up front to frame the future. As you can see, these three features, and particularly the third, also led to the imagining of a separate Pakistan. In this rich, although contentious, imagination of nation, democracy, however, was a muted tune. Therefore, I tend to agree with an important commentator on modern India, Professor Sunil Kilnani, who in a book, Idea of Justice, says, and I quote, India's history in the first half of the 20th century teems with new ideas, arguments, languages, hopes, but amidst these intellectual festivities, the idea of democracy stood in a lonely corner, unquote. It was Ambedkar who brought the idea of democracy to the forefront. In fact, Ambedkar saw nationalism itself through the lens of democracy and argued that nationalism is tenable to the extent it is in tune with democracy. While nationalism as a mighty social force is undeniable, and there is much in common between democracy and nationalism, it is democracy as a political contrivance that has to direct the course of nationalism rather than the other way about. Ambedkar thought, and you might have to follow me because I am not able to see the board. Ambedkar thought that the idea of nation is caught in seemingly opposed tendencies. The first he explored in a book called Pakistan or Partition of India. Taking his cue from Ernest Renan, a 19th century French philosopher, Ambedkar says that nationalism is, and I quote, a social feeling. It is a feeling of corporate sentiment of oneness, which makes those who are charged with it feel that they are kith and kin. This feeling lends itself to seek separate nationhood under certain conditions and has proved itself to be a potent force not easily amenable for suppression. While race, geography, history, a common language, etc., may help in strengthening such a feeling, it is irreducible to them. Using this benchmark, he argued, for instance, that there was a definitive process that led to the reinforcement of the feeling of nationality among Muslims in India, and they could have been argued out of this feeling only by consciously reinforcing a bond of togetherness with other Indians, and not through assertions of a common bond. He felt protagonists on the scene, Mahatma Gandhi, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, etc., could hardly rise to this demand. Ambedkar also thought that a nation state can encompass many nationalities and ethnic identities. The question is whether this framework of nation allows the specific sentiment that informs a nationality to flourish, and if there are limits to such expression, the consent of the concerned group is elicited. A nation state may also encompass more than one community with distinct sets of interests to protect, and for the purpose may call for safeguards in a polity. At the same time, he recognized that nationality, ethnic bonds, etc., are fragile entities and may make room for alternative social imaginaries, depending upon their perception of the fairness of their political accommodation. Against the tendency of essentialization of these categories, Ambedkar was making them fluid asserting the need of conscious engagement between and across them, and remaining alert to alternative possibilities. He saw democracy as a resource for the same. Ambedkar explores the second tendency that characterized a nation in a large text called What Congress and Gandhi Have Done to the Untouchables. In it, he argues that the rise of national sentiment in India has also led to the consolidation of a governing class. It has a complex internal composition, economic interests entwined with elements drawn from traditional modes of domination. Therefore, the governing class is a social class that reflects the effect of the entire ensemble of a social formation, the economic, political, and ideological. With regards to its internal composition, it is distinctive to societies, although there are certain shared features across all governing classes. He thought that it is important to make a close empirical analysis to delineate the space of the governing class and not apply supposedly universal norms without consideration to the context. In India itself, Ambedkar saw such a governing class in what he called the Shetji Bhatji combined, that is, indigenous capital and Brahmanism, which, and I quote, having been freed from the incubus of British imperialism, will acquire greater strength and vigor. It will capture power as the governing classes in every country do. To the opposite side of the governing class is the servile class, which, like its counterpart, is the effect of the ensemble of the entire social formation. It consisted of the laboring masses, but also the social strata and communities which remained beholden to the governing class. The untouchables of India were not merely an integral part of this class, but its lowest rung, subject to the meanest occupations and least rewards. The governing class had emerged and showed that the ideology of ranking and gradations that, I continue from where I left, the governing class had ensured that the ideology of ranking and gradation that informed the social order of the caste system was not subjected to assault under the national movement. As a result, the servile classes themselves, divided into umpteen factions and strata, themselves act as the guardians of ranking and hierarchy, which has been the case in India. But so are the other strata of servile classes, although in an involuted inverse order. They seek, he argued, not merely to end their want and poverty, but also insult and indignity, which they have to bear as a result of the vicious social order. Drawing lessons from this experience of India, Ambedkar felt that post-colonial nationalism was a deeply divided house, one part of it tilted to guard privilege and pelf, and the other towards democracy, both as an enabling resource and as a resource for racial social transformation. How does Ambedkar envisage the promise of democracy, and what are the considerations that he advances? In a speech in 1952, Ambedkar argues, and I quote him, "My definition of democracy is a form and method of government whereby revolutionary changes in the economic and social life of the people are brought about without bloodshed." Unquote. This is not an isolated idea, but recurs in Ambedkar's writings at several places. He also distinguished between constitutional democracy and social democracy as two moments of the realization of this idea. And I want to spend a little more time on the distinction that he makes. Constitutional democracy for Ambedkar is welding the nation into a viable political community of free and equal citizens, and ensuring that it comes to be reproduced over time and makes way for expansive democracy. And Ambedkar's usage of the concept of expansive democracy, for those of you who are familiar with Marx's writings in New Rheinische Zeitung in 1848 and 1849, is almost the same. Of course, Marx changes his positions later, but Ambedkar's usage of this concept of expansive democracy is similar. What happens, however, if the nation is caught in the kind of divide that we charted and encompasses diverse nationalities and communities? Because this question is, in a way, unique to India. Under such conditions, Ambedkar argues, the constitutional frame must represent the social reality at hand and be an enabling resource for the pursuit of liberties and equality of members of the citizen community. In a specific setting, and I quote him, the machinery for setting up a democratic government cannot be a matter of dogma, but need to respond to the social conditions in view and the developments such response begets. I want to state there are 8 important interventions that Ambedkar makes as far as the constitutional document of India is concerned, which are specifically Ambedkar's. And I am just stating them. The first one is this entire concept of we the people as the constitutive authority of public power. Second one is the idea of republic, denoting both active citizenship and snapping of ties with traditional authority. Now, this distinction, which is common today in philosophy, is not something which a lot of members of the Constituent Assembly in India were at home, and therefore they said, why do you want to repeat 2 terms? And Ambedkar had to argue that this distinction is absolutely important for constitutional democracy in India. The third one is a stress on equality of citizenship and enabling measures. And there are 3 types of enabling measures that Ambedkar strongly argues for. 1, political representation to deprived communities. 2, special representation in employment and higher education to the former untouchable communities and to the indigenous communities, as well as to the low castes, officially termed as backward classes. And he begins to argue that the state should take a proactive stance as far as these communities are concerned. And these are all part of Indian constitutional document today. Ambedkar pioneers the argument that socially engendered obstacles for equality of citizenship, such as untouchability practices and gender inequalities, must be put in the Constitution itself so that the subsequent legislatures are not going to tinker with them. He proposes a complex set of minority rights, enabling them to pursue their profession of faith, cultural identity, language, educational pursuits, etc. Often Ambedkar is seen as an opponent of Gandhi in terms of village republics, but Ambedkar very strongly argues for decentralization of powers in order to uphold cultural and linguistic diversity, particularly with regard to indigenous communities. And Ambedkar stands tall in his argument for the independence of the judiciary in India. And today, a lot of constitutional lawyers would tell us that probably Indian judiciary, particularly the higher realms of the judiciary, is one of the best in the world. Apart from such specific provisions, there are three emphases that are characteristic of Ambedkar. One, flexibility of the Constitution to respond to the needs and wishes of an ongoing democratic community. Two, responsiveness of public power as more desirable than political stability. And three, and this is quite important, emphasis on the unity of the political community across its complexity so that it does not fritter away its ability to act and to review itself. A closer view of these provisions and emphasis demonstrate that Ambedkar envisaged a unified constitutional polity with a strong tilt to egalitarianism, factoring in both disadvantage and diversity. At the same time, Ambedkar argues that constitutional democracy must disenable the hold of the governing class on the polity, and it would be foolhardy to believe that mere electoral democracy suffices for it. In a way, refuting Joseph Schumpeter's argument in Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, as if by hindsight. This book was published in 1942, but Ambedkar writes in 1945. But I do not know whether Ambedkar had seen this argument. Probably not, because that was the best time, that was one of the most busiest time in his life. So I don't expect, I have not seen any reference. But Ambedkar argues, and I quote him, constitutional morality, adult suffrage, and frequent election alone cannot be taken as the be-all and end-all of democracy. The governing classes know by experience that such mechanisms have not proved fatal to their power and their position. Indeed, they have helped to give to their power and prestige the virtue of legality and made themselves less vulnerable to attack by the servile classes, unquote. Ambedkar argues, and I quote him, self-government and democracy become real not when constitution based on adult suffrage comes into existence, but when the governing class loses its power to capture the power to govern, unquote. While in certain countries the governing classes could be dislodged through universal elections, something which Marx was to say about Britain and the United States, through universal elections. In other countries, the servile classes are in need of additional support to rescue themselves from being, and I quote, beasts of burden, but also beasts of prey. Again, Ambedkar would leave the considered judgment on this issue to the close analysis of the context. Constitutional democracy would remain largely formal if it is not nurtured in a public culture of constitutional morality. Ambedkar quotes extensively from the work of George Grote's History of Greece to argue that such a moral stance calls for resting public authority on the confidence of a free citizen community and respect for constitutional principles across political divide and changing political fortunes. He found that India did not have a conducive soil for the nurturing of constitutional morality, caught as it was in a culture of graded inequality with inbuilt dispositions of condescension and contempt on the one hand, and deferences and servility on the other. It would also imply that citizens do not, and I quote him, lay their liberties at the feet of even a great man or to trust him with powers which enable him to subvert their institutions, unquote. Ambedkar thought that in India's fragmented and graded social life and culture of hero worship, it is an uphill task to foster constitutional morality. Constitutional democracy should be the enabling ground to a transition to social democracy, where what is a social democracy? Social democracy is where a self-governing community defines its ends independent of regulative devices or appeal to authority. Ambedkar felt that political democracy cannot last unless there lies as the basis of it social democracy. What does social democracy mean? It means a way of life which recognizes liberty, equality, and fraternity as the principles of life. He felt, and I'm quoting him, these principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity are not to be treated as separate items in a trinity. They form a union of trinity in the sense that to divorce one from the other is to defeat the very purpose of democracy. Without equality, liberty would produce the supremacy of the few over the many. Equality without liberty would kill individual initiative. Without fraternity, liberty and equality could not become a natural choice of things. It would require a constable to enforce them, unquote. Ambedkar argued that while liberty, equality, and fraternity were the slogans of the French Revolution, these values much antedate the French Revolution and were preached by the Buddha himself. He felt that social democracy can thrive only in the context of a moral foundation to social life, which eventually he was to discover in Buddhism. But before he took his diksha to Buddhism, there is already a vivid imagination of this democracy that he cults out by referring too partly to the work of John Dewey. A social democracy is primarily a mode of associated life, a conjoint communicated experience. It is essentially an attitude of respect and reverence towards fellow men. Mobility is characteristic of such association. It is, and he quotes from Dewey here, Dewey was his teacher, it is full of channels for conveying a change taking place in one part to the other part. In it, there should be many interests consciously communicated and shared. There should be varied and free points of contact with other modes of association. Following Dewey, he calls this as social endosmosis. Such an association begets resocialization of one's socialized attitudes. In place of the old, it creates a new like-mindedness which is representative of the interests, aims, and aspirations of all the various groups concerned, unquote. It appreciates not merely liberty of thought, speech, movement, and occupation, but also liberty to benefit by an effective and competent use of a person's powers. And those of you who are familiar with the work of T.H. Green and his work on political obligation would know that this is the straightaway definition that T.H. Green uses in his lectures. Ambedkar did his doctorate in science in economics at the London School of Economics and was therefore extensively exposed to this thought current. In such an association, in such a political association, some men are not forced to accept from others the purposes which control their conduct. In such an association, equality does not rest on birth, education, family name, business connections, and inherited wealth, but on a person's efforts. And for it to be so, people need to be treated equally without consideration to physical heredity and social inheritance or endowment. In this context, he subjected both liberal democracy and Marxism, as he actually found them, to a trenchant critique. Ambedkar felt that while liberal democracy upholds a system of rights and liberties to one and all, it runs deficit in the following respects. One, it is not sensitive to some of the most profound cravings of human beings, such as respect and dignity, and inadequately sensitive to the deepest urge of human beings to pursue their own destiny. He quoted the work of the French philosopher Jacques Maritain extensively in this regard. Two, liberal democracy is not adequately sensitive to the sociality of human beings, they being the products of sociality and agents at the same time. Three, liberal democracy is excessively focused on political democracy and not social and economic democracy. Without social and economic democracy, political democracy remains not merely skewed, but politically unstable. Four, while liberal democracy posts religion to the private sphere, it at the same time ignores certain sensibilities bound with religion that are deeply spiritual, such as deferences to human worth, reasonableness, search for human excellence, compassion, reaching out to human suffering, a sense of balance, and the moral grounding they lead up to. It is they which sustain a commitment to liberties. It is these virtues which are deeply spiritually vetted, sustain a commitment to liberties and equality and furtherance of community bonds. Together, they constitute the moral grounding of societies. Eventually, Ambedkar was to identify such a moral grounding in the teachings of the Buddha. Reflecting on the collapse of liberal democracy to fascism and using the term liberal democracy interchangeably with parliamentary democracy, he argues that liberal democracy, and I quote him, took no notice of economic inequalities and did not care to examine the result of freedom of contract on the parties to the contract, in spite of the fact that they were unequal in their bargaining power. It did not mind if the freedom of contract gave the strong the opportunity to defraud the weak. The result is that parliamentary democracy, in standing out as the protagonist of liberty, has continuously added to the economic wrongs of the poor, the downtrodden, and the disinherited class. Parliamentary democracy developed a passion for liberty. It never made even a nodding acquaintance with equality. It failed to realize the significance of equality and did not even endeavor to strike a balance between liberty and equality, with the result that liberty swallowed equality and has made democracy a name and a farce. He rejected what he felt were the widely popular tenets of Marxism, such as economic determinism, polarization of classes, historical teleology, conception of universality, dictatorship of the proletariat, withering away of the state, and endorsement of violence. He was too fascinated by the creative potentialities of human agency. He refused to accept the foundational principle of materialist dialectics of the primacy of being over consciousness as lending to positivism. For him, consciousness became the key to human understanding and the world we construct. And therefore, in his writings, you find a very strong hermeneutic stance. Later, he read this epistemological perspective in the teachings of the Buddha. At the same time, Ambedkar endorses Marxist understanding that society is made of classes, There is conflict among classes leading to class struggle, and the major reason for the struggle is the private ownership of and control over the means of production. He felt an entire architecture of politics and culture has been built in defense of private property. He wholly endorsed one of Marx's theses against Feuerbach, that philosophers have always interpreted the world. The task is to change it. And in his great work on the Buddha and his Dhamma, he argued, he made the Buddha a kind of, Marx in anticipation. And the Buddha is engaging with the world rather than with the mystical notions, esoteric and mystical notions. The last few things I want to say: contemporary modes of oppression and exclusion. What is the bearing, a critique of post-colonial nationalism and conception of democracy that I have charted above got to do with the complex marginalities and their demand for equal consideration in our times? Let me suggest it at two levels. Within India, certain communities and social groups who consider themselves as deeply marginalized have veered around, shedding their earlier affiliations to the writings of Ambedkar as a resource and to the Dalit movement inspired by him. Of course, it is a complex process with many twists and turns. Many an educated Muslim young person today, particularly if he or she hails from a non-Ashrafi background, who is deeply committed to democracy, has begun to feel that post-colonial India has done little to enable the community. Professor Javed Alam elaborates this extensively in his writings. The minority rights conferred by the Constitution while reinforcing the hold of a community elite has led to their ghettoization rather than according them an equal say in determining the future of the society they live in. Ambedkar's arguments for democracy as an enabling resource and open access make sense to them more than ever. A vast number of Dalits and low castes feel likewise. While a section of them have found economic mobility under affirmative action programs, there has not been a significant change in their relative condition vis-à-vis upper castes. Even certain radical measures carried out with regard to land reforms have not benefited Dalits, as their dependence on land could not certify entitlement to it. Women feel that caste as a social relation institutes a specific kind of caste patriarchy, subordinating them to its dictates and denying them agency. Significant sections of the votaries of women's movement in India, cutting across religious communities, find much in common with Ambedkar's stance on gender relations and personal laws. Only among indigenous communities struggling for their autonomy and cultural identity, there has not been a significant outreach to Ambedkar as yet. In the wider context, several Afro-American writers and young blacks in several parts of Africa have begun to feel equality elusive to them under the dispensation they are called upon to live in. The promises of post-coloniality have proved elusive. Ambedkar is increasingly making his presence felt in this vacuum. There is much comparative study on Ambedkar on one hand, and Frantz Fanon and Paul Freire on the other. But the most decisive engagement has been between Ambedkar and Afro-American writing in the last 2 decades. There are also interesting critical linkages that are built between Ambedkar and the writings of Hannah Arendt and Giorgio Agamben. In one of his recent essays in a book that I have just edited, titled The Burdened Life, Ambedkar, Arendt, and Perplexity of Rights. Homi K. Bhabha, the Harvard academic, argues how the experience of the refugee resonates some of the key concerns raised by Ambedkar. One of the key connecting bonds that has facilitated such a response is on account of the fact that Ambedkar speaks to a human condition of marginality with deep awareness of the transatlantic world. His learning and his writings are as much an engagement with transatlantic thought as it is with that of India. A couple of sentences by way of conclusion. If I have read Ambedkar and the scholarship that invokes him rightly, we are far from end of history, and you know where the phrase comes from. And the cry for equality is ever before us. This call is closely bound with an enabling idea of liberty and making democracy not merely a contrivance to choose political elites, but to make it a way of life. But complex marginalities can hardly invoke the numbers and the powers that once shaped calls for radical social reconstruction. While a critical mass of the deprived and the marginalized across the world may still close ranks, they cannot be an effective countervailing force arraigned against them. But such an endeavor, Ambedkar thought, can be pursued through a democratic project anchored in moral sensibilities resonating with it. Thank you. And sorry for this mishap.
Yes, apologies for the complete collapse of technology. We have no idea what happened. Fortunately, we had a clear and informed mind and voice and 200 attentive ears. I counted them all. So it was a success, I think. We do have time, and we have 2 microphones, so we can field a few questions. If there are questions for Professor Rodrigues, feel free to raise them. Shiraz.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Rodrigues. My question is about Ambedkar. When he was writing the Constitution, did he have any idea of putting certain percentage of women in the House of Parliament? And do you see any future of election democracy without political parties representing people? Because there has been suggestion that candidates should come without any links to any political parties.
To any one of the parties.
Sorry?
The second part?
Yeah, that without having Indian Congress or any of these, like most of these political parties are just one party with multiple names.
Anyway, this is a big question. Ambedkar is the strongest votary of gender inequality in India, and pioneered, and I have repeated it in some other lecture elsewhere, pioneered this voluminous, heavily laden bill on the reform of the Hindu code. It runs into about 1,600 pages. Ambedkar is a constitutional lawyer, probably one of the tallest constitutional lawyers that India produced, and therefore was very familiar with the traditional systems of law in India. And Ambedkar identifies several dimensions within personal law which actually reproduce the subordination of women in India within the Hindu law. And there are, of course, similar kinds of messages that he sends with regard to the Mohammedan law, the Mohammedan law as passed by the British Parliament in 1936. Now, what are Ambedkar's problems? Ambedkar says that the existing Hindu personal law treats women unequally with regard to inheritance, with regard to the choice of marriage she makes, with regard to adoption of children, and with regard to the property from the parental side. Now, Ambedkar thinks that this is absolutely unfair and begins to work out an alternative way by which equality could be worked out. But interestingly, all these provisions were deeply caught with the caste system in India. And therefore, these provisions varied with regard to different castes. And Ambedkar argues in this particular bill that he introduced in the Constituent Assembly, which acted at that time as the legislature simultaneously, that the choice of marriage should not involve caste. While people could marry within caste, but the choice of marriage itself should not be bound with regard to caste. And even if a woman marries somebody who is outside the caste, she should have a right to inheritance, she should have a say in terms of adopted children, and so on. Now, this is something which was unimaginable in 1948, 50. And even somebody, a popular leader like Jawaharlal Nehru, could not withstand it. And there was very strong protests and large demonstrations of orthodoxy in the streets. If you look at the book, Pakistan and Partition of India, Ambedkar argues that communalism, the brunt of communalism in India, is primarily borne by women, because communal strife, that is religious strifes, allows each one of the community to hold on to their women so that they do not trespass the boundaries. And thereby, their liberty comes to be sacrificed. So if you have one person who begins to very forthrightly begins to argue this position with regard to equality and gender justice, I think the early voice was that of Dr. Ambedkar. Now, the other question, of course, is a very contemporary question. And that is elections, people standing for elections without bypassing political parties. Now, I come from the background of the discipline. I don't think you can run people who are about 1.4 billion today, through discrete candidates. Just to give you the significance of it, Canada has a population of about 36 million. Now, India has today a population of 1.4 billion. And an average constituency of the lower house in India has an electorate of about 2.5 million. So you can't be going around houses campaigning for your candidature. And political parties, therefore, become absolute instruments for the sustenance of electoral democracy in India. The question is whether they can do their campaigning differently and begin to stand for positions in a strong way. But just to push that argument a little, and I have been deeply perplexed with regard to this. We have a political party, which is the ruling party in India today, which very strongly argues for what a word that I'm using now, hard Hindu identity, strong, thick Hindu identity. And it has mobilized them around this particular identity. Now, this identity has deep roots in India. It goes back to the 19th century when a constituency called the Hindu came to be precipitated. Now, how do you unwind this particular constituency? There are lots of people who begin to feel that it is not necessary to unwind it, but the future of India can probably be looked into by holding on to this particular identity. But if you want to unwind it and at the same time win the elections, what can you do? You need to prove yourself as a Hindu. So there are lots of people who began to look around for an inclusive democratic project in India, but political necessity has thrust them to argue the case that they too are Hindus. Now, this is a big problem that an electoral democracy confronts, and I do not think there are easy way out of it, unless, of course, you want to take abstinence from politics or want to walk out of it. So my suggestion here is, if you want to actually play the game of electoral democracy, there are certain requirements, and those requirements at least have to be tactically worked out, and constantly aiming to recreate critical energies for the future. Yeah. But you don't know when things are going to collapse. Yeah. Yeah. Any other? Yeah.
Hi, my name is Irene Pang. I am assistant professor at the School for International Studies. So thank you very much for your talk. I had two related questions. I think the first one you've already commented on a little bit. I wanted to ask you about what you thought about the future of Indian democracy, right? Towards the end of your lecture, you suggested that Ambedkar's thinking may be one way through which we can imagine futures more creatively. But you have also pointed out in your response just now that Indian politics, contemporary Indian politics, is still very much embedded in caste politics, or politics in the name of religion. And so Ambedkar, as a Dalit political thinker, how can we bring his thought back into the public narrative? And that relates to my second question, which is, I wonder how you see the base of mobilization in India. How is it going to take its form? Right? If we think about the quality of social democracy in India, we see huge discrepancies between the North and the South. And the favorite anomaly in the social sciences is the case of Kerala. Right? And in Kerala, there have been huge improvements in equality and social well-being in terms of class, in terms of caste, in terms of gender. But that is very much the result of mobilization based on workers, right? But do you see workers or labor as still the base of mobilization going forward in contemporary India? Thanks.
Thank you. I think I need to break it down in terms of several components. The first one is, how do I see the future of democracy in India? I think I have tended to argue that Indian democracy has very deep roots. It is probably the most important discovery that India has made. And I think it is strong, but let me elaborate this a little. From the 1950s onwards, one of the central considerations in India has been, how do you sustain a democratic project in a society which is deeply embedded in inequality and hierarchies? Now, Ambedkar argues that the chances of democracy surviving in India are too feeble. But there emerged alternatives, partly inspired by Ambedkar, but partly inspired by several other social forces who begin to argue that the only way that constitutional democracy in India can be sustained is by combining constitutional electoral democracy with powerful social movements. And this combinatory of social movements and public debate, partly institutionalized in the parliament, but partly independent of it, has been the great reinforcing dimension of constitutional democracy in India. And I have traveled in some countries, may not be as much as some of you have done. I have not seen the vibrancy of social movements and the kind of debates that take place even at the local levels as they take place in India, anywhere else in the world. So I see a future for democracy in India. Number two, wherever there is this combination has worked, there has been a remarkable development in terms of relative development of human equalities. Kerala is one of the examples. But Kerala is only one of the examples. There are other places where these things have become significant. Take a small state in the Himalayas called Himachal Pradesh, which was locked up in the 1960s in a deeply feudal context. Today, it has the highest human development index, partly combining social movements with the public debates institutionalized in the local legislatures and local bodies. Coming to something called Dalit politics and Ambedkar, a question that you touched. Dalits in India, that is, Dalits are people who are belonging to the social constituency of Dr. Ambedkar. There are about over 400 Dalit castes and communities in India. Ambedkar belonged to one of them. Some of them are large, some of them are small. Some of them have benefited much more than the others. But they are about 17% of the population of India. That is about 200 million. And 17% of the population is a huge political force. And someone like Ambedkar today has his presence, not merely in the community, in these groups, but also among low castes who are numerous, and also among minorities, particularly, as I was suggesting, among Muslims. So while immediately it looks like a bleak scene, I don't think the present scene is going to be the determinant of what is going to happen in the future. Now, there are intellectuals who have argued that India is around some kind of a fascist state. I don't believe in it. Why I don't believe in it is the kind of countervailing forces that are present in India, both institutional and social. And these countervailing forces may not necessarily reflect in electoral choices, but if there is an attack frontally on the democratic ethos, they have enough strength to gather themselves together, as already we have had the case in 1977, when a much more powerful leader with huge amount of populist backing called Indira Gandhi imposed emergency, declared election, and lost badly in the elections. Now, if you look at when she declared emergency in 1975, the opposition were were a few in numbers. But at the end, they were to come back to power. So I'm very optimistic, you know. And I think the poor in India definitely do not have as good life as elsewhere. But I think they have a great deal of choice that the system offers in terms of bequeathing respect and dignity. Just a small story, and I will wind up. If you are an official in public bodies, you have to go for electoral duties in India. And I have acted as an officer, electoral officer, several times when I was young. And there was a blind old man who was led by his daughter-in-law who came to the polling booth. And once he entered the polling booth, he said, "Show me the symbol of the hand." The symbol of hand is the symbol of the Congress party. Now, the polling officers were stunned because you cannot ask to show the symbol of the political party. And then he pushed his daughter-in-law, walked straight to my table, and he said, "I'm the voter. I want to know where is the symbol of the hand. So bypass your rules and look at my intentions." And I knew that his intention and his will is much superior to the rule book that the system had dispensed me to operate in the system. And I took him to the polling booth and said, "Number 2, push your hand down to the second position and you will find the symbol." Now, this is something which is interesting because public debates and elections have led to reinforcing the power of the disenabled and the power of the weak in India. Probably this is going to be the strength of the future. Yeah. Sorry.
Hello. Only one question. I'm very sorry, only 1 second. We have to hurry because it's getting cold. I like a very simple question. What means the Dalit and Dwech?
Dalit and?
Dwech.
Yeah, he's asking me the distinction between Dalits and Dvij. There's a term that is used. Dvij is a term that is used in Sanskrit, but is common across many Indian languages. That is twice born, referring primarily to the upper caste. But the 3 upper castes, that is the Brahmins, the Kshatriyas, and the Vaishyas. The Shudras do not have a right to go through what is called the Upanayan ceremony and wear the sacred thread. And of course, Dalits, the untouchables, they cannot wear the sacred thread. Although now there have been reformist movements where communities from Dalits and from the Shudras have come to wear the sacred thread and a way of upward mobility which is there across India alongside assertions of autonomy of these communities and castes. So both these processes are at work and not merely a process of conflict and standoff. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, can we thank Professor Rodrigues? Thank you all for coming, and please stay. Join us all for some food and refreshments. Perhaps corner Professor Rodrigues with more questions if you have them. So once again, thanks to you all, and do enjoy, do stay. Thank you.